Great. Hi. So look, thanks again for joining us, everyone. Way of introduction, my name's Russell. I sit on the IRBA board and I've been working in business analysis or leading business analysts for about 15 years now. I've built BA teams in some fairly intense situations. I was at Lehman Brothers when the financial system collapsed, and I worked in big pharma when the world was watching every data point during COVID. I've spent a lot of my career sitting in rooms where people wanted certainty and it just wasn't there. So I want to start with a confession. This talk isn't about dashboards. The original title that I proposed at Toronto was The Theatre and Illusion of Control, which you see on your screen now. But it got changed on me. So if you came here hoping to learn about dashboard layouts or KPI frameworks, then this probably isn't the talk for you. Because this talk isn't about dashboards. It's a talk about power hiding in plain sight. Dashboards look harmless. They're neat, they're tidy, they're a bit boring, right? If we're honest. But that's the trick. Because behind something that looks that simple is a huge amount of power. It's the power to decide what gets seen, what gets ignored. And I'm going to put forward the idea today that dashboards don't show reality, they shape it. Organisations all say the same thing. We're data driven, we make data led decisions, we're led by data. But I want to say something uncomfortable. Oh, sorry, the PowerPoint's not working. Oh, oh, sorry, the slides aren't working. You'll get them in the you'll get them in the thing. Every there's no such thing as a data-driven decision. Data doesn't decide, people do. And afterwards, we use data to make that decision seem inevitable. When someone says the data's made us do it, what they normally mean is no one will get fired for this. And that's not analysis, it's insurance. And here's the part we don't like admitting. Dashboards aren't the problem, we are. And I include myself in that. I've built plenty of dashboards to remove politics, to hide them. We build dashboards because they protect us. They turn judgment into something that looks objective. They turn opinion into something that you can defend in a steering meeting. And sometimes they shut people down. You'll hear things like the data speaks for itself, which really means don't question it. Some dashboards don't exist to explain reality. They exist to end conversations. And once the conversation stops, then so does the thinking. And once you start seeing that, you start to notice something else. Data isn't neutral. It's persuasive. I was reminded of this recently. I was asked in an interview, what would I do if two different data sets gave opposite answers? And I said, well, I don't really like data. I didn't get offered the job. But what I meant was data is always someone's argument. It just gets presented like it isn't. It wears a costume of objectivity. Two data sets moving in opposite directions aren't contradicting each other. Two conflicting data sets are two conflicting narratives. If I said it like that, who knows? The interviewer might have actually got offered the job. We also hear people say that data is the most valuable commodity in the world. I don't think that's quite right, because data on its own isn't really worth much. If it was, spreadsheets would be priceless. What actually makes data valuable is the feeling it gives us, the feeling that we're in control. And that's what we want to see in dashboards: control. The belief that if we model enough, visualize enough, measure enough, then reality will behave itself. But history has told us otherwise, because every time we think we've found a way to control reality, we haven't. We've just changed the tools. So I want to go back. I want to go back about 120 years when these tools looked like a stopwatch. A man walked into a factory carrying a stopwatch. His name was Frederick Winslow Taylor. Now, Taylor believed that if you timed every movement a worker made, every step, every reach, every pause, you could design one best way to work, measure everything, control everything. And for a while, it worked. Productivity improved, output increased. But something else disappeared: judgment, autonomy, flexibility. Taylorism didn't fail because it was cruel, although sometimes it was. It failed because people aren't machines. They never have been. But that idea that Taylor gave us, that human behaviour could be measured, modelled, and controlled, didn't die in the factory. It got noticed. One person who noticed it was Vladimir Lenin, who in 1914 wrote about Taylor's system. And to be fair to Lenin, he saw exactly what it was: a tool for control, a way of extracting more from workers who already had very little power. And as you expect, he was deeply critical of it. But here's the twist: Lenin didn't reject it. Instead, he said, under capitalism, Taylor's system enslaves. But under socialism, well, we could use it differently. Same system, different story. A few years later, after the revolution, the idea scaled. Under Stalin, the 5-year plans, everything measured, everything targeted, everything controlled. The Soviet Union factories didn't just make goods, they produced numbers. On paper, it was a triumph. Steel production up, coal production up, targets met. In reality, there were warehouses filled with goods that nobody needed, shoes in the wrong sizes, people hitting their targets, but missing the point. Different ideology, same illusion. But the idea didn't stop there, because once you believe you can control, the next step is obvious. You try and control something bigger. And we go to the Cold War, that there were a group of analysts at the Rand Corporation, and they began asking a different kind of question. Not what should we do, but what happens if we model it? One of those analysts was Alan Enthoven. He was a pioneer of systems analysis. He applied maths to weaponize systems thinking, game theory, simulation, optimization. And that logic got applied to nuclear strategy. Enthoven modelled escalation, he modelled retaliation, and he modelled outcomes, including something deeply uncomfortable: civilian casualties. Not as tragedy, as a variable. Alan Enthoven used systems analysis to try and find the optimal number of dead Russians that would force a surrender in a nuclear war without causing the end of the world. How many losses could a system absorb? At what point does retaliation stop? At what point do you start to negotiate? Perfectly rational questions, perfectly analytical, but completely detached from lived reality. Because once you reduce human consequences to numbers, you can optimize them. And once you can optimize them, you can justify them. Taylor measured movement, the Soviets measured production, and now they were measuring survival. Same logic, different scale. Now, around this time, Rand Corporation commissioned a game. It was designed to test how rational actors behave when operating inside a system of competing incentives. The game was called, and I appreciate this is a professional setting, Fuck You, Buddy. The rules were simple. Players could cooperate or they could betray. And what the game showed consistency across every group that played it was that the most rational individual strategy was betrayal. Not because the players were bad people, but because the system rewarded it. The game was designed to model nuclear deterrence, but what it actually revealed was something far more uncomfortable. When you design a system with the wrong incentives, rational people will do irrational things. Not through malice, through logic. Build the wrong dashboard, reward the wrong behaviour, and perfectly rational people will game it every single time. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because these weren't bad people. They were smart, rational, doing exactly what the system had asked them to do. And that thinking didn't stay in theory. The people building these models, they leave, they go into other jobs, and they take that thinking with them. So around this time, something else happens. Those ideas didn't stay in government or the military. They started to move into business. Not as theory, as people. Analysts trained to model complex systems now applying that thinking to organisations. There were 10 young American analysts who approached Ford Motor Company as a group. They spent the war applying mathematics to military logistics, moving men, moving materials, optimising systems. Now, at the time, Ford was in chaos and they needed analytical firepower. So Ford Motor Company hired all 10 of them, and they became known as the Whiz Kids. One of them was Robert McNamara. He rose through Ford using exactly the same logic Taylor had pioneered. Measure everything, model everything, optimize everything. Control through data. Control through systems thinking. By 1960, he was president of Ford. He was the first person at the time outside of the Ford family to hold that role. And then John F. Kennedy recruited him as the Secretary of Defense. And McNamara brought the Ford production line directly into the Pentagon. The same thinking that had optimized car manufacturing would now be applied to fighting the Vietnam War. In 1961, McNamara called our old friend, our system analyst, Alan Enthoven. The same man who had modelled nuclear casualties at Rand was now modelling a war in Southeast Asia. Together with the American commanders, they created a metric called body count. The more enemy they killed, Enthoven reasoned the closer they were to victory. Taylor stopwatch, McNamara spreadsheet, same logic, different jungle. And at first the numbers looked good. Targets were met, kills counts increased, but sometimes the numbers were guessed, sometimes they were exaggerated, sometimes civilians were candidate fighters because the dashboard said that meant success. Remember again, the system rewarded betrayal. Not because the soldiers were that bad people, but because the incentives were wrong. And we all know they lost the war. Turns out winning the metric isn't the same as winning the war. The same idea that failed on the factory floor failed in the jungle. But it still didn't die. It migrated. Same logic, just applied somewhere new. Control, measurement, illusion, failure. Now, it's easy to look at that and think, well, that's war. That's extreme. But then we see this logic shows up somewhere closer to home. Well, closer to my home in the UK. Alan Enthoven didn't just stay in America. He was asked by a UK Prime Minister called Margaret Thatcher to bring the same framework to Britain, advising on how government departments could be run using targets, performance indicators, and internal competition. Margaret Thatcher introduced internal markets to the government department in the 1980s. But one of her successors, Tony Blair, scaled it, in particular with waiting time targets in the UK National Health Service, the NHS, in the 1990s. And the hospitals adapted and reacted to these targets, not always by improving care, but by improving the numbers. Famously, during Blair's time, some hospitals created a role called a hello nurse. This was a nurse who was positioned at the entrance of a ward. Not because you needed immediate care, but her greeting to say hello to a patient meant the patient had been seen by a nurse, and it stopped the clock. The waiting time target was met, and the dashboard looked clean. Some hospitals removed wheels from trolleys So patients technically weren't on the trolley and didn't count in the waiting times. Corridors were reclassified as wards. Remember the game. Rational people, wrong incentives. Now, I was told a story by a speech therapist I know who worked in the NHS at this time. I want to keep them anonymous. So, in order to protect their identity, I'll just say, and my mum. Now, one of her jobs was that she used to do a 2-year check on every child, speech, movement, development. If something looked wrong, they referred early. Early intervention was cheap and it worked. Then someone decided that the 2-year check wasn't necessary. Parents could come in if they were concerned. And something predictable happened. Referrals dropped. Not because children were healthier, but because no one was looking. These lower numbers then became evidence. We don't need as many therapists. The data shows demand is falling. We can cut the budget. The data showed nothing of the sort. The data showed what happens when you stop measuring. Those children arrived at school unable to tie their shoes, unable to sit and listen, unable to hold a pencil. The problem didn't disappear, it just moved from health to education, from interventions that cost hundreds to interventions that cost thousands. But the dashboard looked clean. The data spoke for itself. The children paid the price. And that's a good trade if you work for health. If you look at the dashboard, Taylor had a stopwatch, Starling had a quota, McNamara had a spreadsheet, Blair had a waiting time target. Same idea, different buildings, consistent damage. Now it's easy to look at all that, the Vietnam, the NHS, and think that's extreme, that's politics. That's not what we do, but it is. Because the same logic shows up in much quieter ways in steering meetings, in program reviews, in the dashboards we build every day, just with better formatting. The difference is no one dies in a steering meeting. Well, they shouldn't. So we don't question it as hard. Dashboards promise clarity. KPIs promise certainty. OKRs promise alignment. But let me ask you something. Who here has sat in a meeting when the numbers look fantastic and everybody knew things weren't working? Dashboards don't lie maliciously. They lie convincingly. Because dashboards reward what's measurable, not what matters. They smooth out complexity. They make the reality presentable. When the reality doesn't match the numbers, reality is what gets ignored. Most dashboards don't exist to explain reality. They exist to end conversations. And they're very good at it. And after a while, something else happens. People stop managing the system. They start managing the dashboard. And once that happens, the dashboard becomes the system. People stop living in reality. They start living inside the numbers. And that's the real danger. Now, when society, metrics alone weren't enough, we tried something else. We tried surveillance. In the 18th century, Jeremy Bentham designed the panopticon. It was a prison where inmates could be watched at any time. Imagine a guard tower in the middle and cells outside facing inwards. The genius wasn't the tower in that, it was the psychology, because the prisoners learned to control themselves because they couldn't be sure when they were being watched and when they weren't being watched. Later, Michel Foucault, the French existentialist philosopher, showed how this logic escaped the prison and went into schools, hospitals, factories, offices, all structured around observation, measurement, and normalization. Surveillance produces data. It does not produce understanding. And when behavior is watched long enough, it becomes performative. People stop doing what is real and start doing what is visible. Surveillance, like dashboards, doesn't reveal reality. It changes it. A dashboard is surveillance. And this is what Foucault understood and Bentham didn't. The panopticon doesn't just watch people, it teaches them to watch themselves. The nurse who stopped the clock knew the care wasn't right. The manager who removed the trolley wheels knew patients were still waiting. The analyst counting body counts knew the numbers were wrong. They knew. But the dashboard said otherwise. And the dashboard ended the conversation. That's not a data problem. That's a power problem. Let me say something uncomfortable about our own profession. Business analysts like to think we reveal truth, but that's not always why we're hired. Sometimes we're hired to make decisions look inevitable, to turn something messy and political into requirements that look neutral. I know what it costs to ask the question nobody in the room wants to hear. I've done this work and I've failed to do it as well. If I go back to my time at Lehman Brothers, one of my last pieces of analysis was moving assets out of a system called Euroclear. Euroclear had a rule that if an asset hadn't been traded in 3 months, it was priced to zero. We moved them to places where they weren't priced at zero. And numbers looked a lot better. But I didn't ask, but these are still worthless though, right? Nobody actually wants to buy these. We've improved the numbers on the dashboard, but they're still worthless. No. I thought we were solving a systems problem. I was a system thinker. Months later, and Lehman collapsed. I was left outside the building holding a cardboard box with stuff from my desk in it, wondering what I was going to go home and say to my wife. That's how this works. Not bad people, reasonable decisions, no one stepping back far enough to question it. As business analysts, we don't just describe systems, sometimes we legitimize them. That isn't a failure of skill, it's a test of courage. Now, at this point, it's tempting to say, well, AI is going to be the disruptor to this. It isn't. I'm also aware that every talk these days has to mention AI, and didn't want to be left out. Uh, so I'm going to go back to the 60s, and a computer scientist named Joseph Weizenbaum, and he built one of the first conversational programs. He built a script. He called it Eliza. It was a computer script. Now, he built this originally as a provocation. He chose a therapist script which he called Doctor, modelled on an approach by a psychologist called Carl Rogers. Now, Carl Rogers believed that what people needed wasn't diagnosis, wasn't expertise, wasn't answers. They needed to feel genuinely heard. So the therapist reflects back. So, how are you feeling today? I am feeling sad. I hear you're feeling sad. Yes, ever since I broke up with my boyfriend. Tell me about your boyfriend. The patient feels heard. The therapist has said almost nothing. And Rogers called it reflective listening. The idea that presence itself is therapeutic, that feeling genuinely understood is what allows people to heal. And Weisenberg thought that by putting this on a computer, on a machine, it would show the emptiness of the technique. So he did. He programmed it. And then he's asked his secretary to test it, to have a conversation with it. And he expected that she would immediately see through it and see it wasn't real. Instead, something else happened. After about an hour, the secretary asked him to leave the room so she could speak to the computer privately. Weisenberg built a mirror. People saw a mind. Now, Eliza wasn't an LLM. It wasn't even close. It was a few hundred lines of pattern matching. No learning, no understanding, no intelligence. It wasn't artificial intelligence. It was barely a program. And yet, people still handed it their emotional lives. That's not a story about technology. That's a story about us. There are people today who describe their AI companion as their closest relationship. Not ironically, not as a joke, because it always listens, never judges, never has a bad day. Eliza was the first demonstration that humans will anthropomorphize anything that appears to listen or gives them a sense of control. And every system since, every dashboard, every algorithm, every AI has inherited that vulnerability. We don't trust these systems because they're intelligent. We trust them because they sound like they are. Weisenberg spent the rest of his life warning us what this meant. He got shouted down as a pessimist. That was 1966. We didn't listen. Organisations had already spent a century trying to control behaviour through measurement. AI didn't create this problem. It inherited it. Taylor, Stalin, McMahon, Enthoven, Blair. Each one believed that if you could measure enough, model enough, optimize enough, you could finally control reality. And AI arrived when we were ready to believe it was finally possible. Let's take the hiring market at the moment. Long before generative AI, organisations had used models to rank candidates. The promise was objectivity, fairness, efficiency. But a recommendation becomes a game, a ranking becomes a decision, and judgment quietly disappears. We're told AI removes bias, but really, it removes the last moment when bias could be challenged. When a human makes a bad decision, we can ask why. When an algorithm does, it already comes dressed as certainty. And the algorithm decided isn't an explanation, it's the end of accountability. AI hasn't made decisions better, it's made them harder to question. AI hasn't automated intelligence, it's automated authority. And authority without explanation is what some organisations have been comfortable with. Weisenberg built a mirror. We gave it a job title. And this is where you stand between systems that speak in probabilities and organisations that want certainty. Now, your job is not to reject the data. Your job is to slow the leap from correlation to certainty. Prediction is not understanding. Confidence is not truth. Your job isn't to control reality, it's to defend it. Because the most dangerous moment is when the numbers look perfect and nobody says, this isn't what's actually happening. The next time someone shows a dashboard, ask, what did we stop measuring to get this number? What data sets are being ignored? What narrative am I being told? And that's it. That's the theatre. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Russell. I was listening intently there, and kudos to you for like you did it without your slides. I mean, I don't think the
It
slides could
wouldn't,
have possibly
yeah, I
added
was pressing the
anything.
button and it just wouldn't rotate through. So I went, oh,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
all in.
Well, I mean, I think that just shows how interesting your presentation is because I was captivated and listening without any slides.
Thank you.
So we're getting lots of virtual rounds of applause
Thank you
there.
very much.
Um, so, if you do have a question, do type it in the Q&A tab, and we will cover as many questions as we can before the end of the session. I'm just going to drop Russell's LinkedIn address in the chat as well, because I
Thank
always
you
think
very
a
much.
great way of giving a virtual round of applause is to follow people on LinkedIn, so you can hear more about what they
Welcome.
say as well. So Russell, a couple of questions were put in the chat. I can't find them;
Yeah.
they've scrolled away. But one of them I remember because someone was saying, "What about Deming?" Because you mentioned a number of the kind of managerial science thinkers and the early systems thinkers, or well, there'll be a debate about whether they'd be considered
Yeah.
systems thinkers now. We'll put that to one side. So, what about Deming?
Then I hadn't searched him, I'm afraid, so I had to take him away and go away. Have you got a synopsis of his work at all?
So I think it's W. Edwards Deming. I think I mean, in my mind, I mean, yeah. So I may be wrong, but I put him in the same box as some of the Toyota production system type of thing. That may be incorrect. Colin's putting
There was a,
PDCA,
yeah, there
so
was a
the
thing, there
plan
was
do
a,
check.
yeah, now there was an example that I could have used about Toyota as well. And I think Toyota went to, and I can't remember, was it General Motors?
It
And it
did. So
just didn't work. Just
yeah.
didn't work. Didn't get it. Didn't get the culture. Didn't get any of it. So
I mean that is an interesting example as well, and yeah, I don't think Deming was the Toyota production system, but it's in my head they're all kind of in a similar. similar time frame. But yeah, yes, and yeah, and Petra is putting the example in the chat there of I think when it was taken to General Motors and because the cultural differences didn't work. But excellent. And then there was another question that scrolled past. Okay, so Petra said Deming was at the basis of the Toyota system. So and again, the Toyota production system or TPS then sort of became what we now tend to refer to as lean.
Yeah, the
And there
lean.
was
Yeah.
what was the book called The Machine That Changed the World by Womack and Jones? This is off the top of my head. I can't remember. Anyway, I've gone way off on a tangent. So we have a question from
Yeah, sure.
Yev in the questions, which says, if we present a dashboard with things that might not necessarily be comfortable for the audience, do we forego reality control attempts enough to be able to serve a useful purpose? So I think
No,
what
look.
Yev is saying there is actually, should we go ahead and present the uncomfortable truth?
Well, it's gonna, I got asked this question. I got asked the same question in Toronto, right? And I could give two answers. I could give you what I consider the noble and right and just answer is, right? Which is no, of course not. We have to do right. We have to do honest. But I'm going to say what I said, right? I think every situation is an individual situation and it's a subjective situation as well because, you know, we've all got bills to pay. Right, we've all got a mortgage to pay. We've all got these things as well, and it's going to have to be a judgment call. Now, what I'm trying to call for is I'm not trying to get rid of dashboards, right? I'm just trying to get some honest measurements going because I truly believe that without honest measurements, you're not really going to make the right decision, or you're going to make a decision for a narrative reason, and that's fine. I mean, if you make it for another reason, fine, but actually call out the reason why you're making it. Right? If you're making that decision because, hey, we've just spent far too much money on this project, and if we pulled it now, it will make us look bad. Have that as your metric. Yeah,
Yeah.
have the real reason. Now, we don't always have the seat at the table, and we don't always have the power to say that. And sometimes, if you say that, then you might be handed your cards, right? But that's be aware of it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I do think there's an element of. I remember reading a paper a few years ago by an author whose name I've temporarily forgotten, but it was about whistleblowing in the construction industry in the USA. And what it was saying is that theoretically anyone can blow the whistle about a safety incident, except in reality they can't, because if you do, you're probably going to be blocklisted and never get a
Blacklisted, right?
contract again. So you've got that element of actually sometimes if you're in a situation to call stuff out, you've got an element of privilege to to be able to do that. So those that can should.
Yeah, you know, it depends about your work environment as well, right? So in my past, going back years and years and years, one, well, I won't know them, was particularly toxic. I can remember working in this real sort of toxic environment going back, and would I've called things out there? Maybe not, right? Maybe not. But, I'm not going to fake it and give you the noble answer, which I should do in this talk, right? Which is, yeah, call it every time, because it's life, right?
Kind of
Individual decision.
choose your battles, perhaps,
Choose your
is the
battle.
thing to say. Yeah, yeah.
Choose your
Um,
battle. That's a better way of putting it.
Good. And our next question is an anonymous question. And when you submit a question, you can tick a box if you'd rather be anonymous, which is completely fine. And this person says, I'm just wondering, given what you said, if you were asked to set up a performance management capability, would you take it on or would you take it on and run a mile? Or if so, how would you guard against providing the wrong information? So I guess if you're managing a capability within an organization and they're saying we want the performance to increase, here are a bunch of metrics. Would you run a mile? Would you engage with it? What would you do?
No, it's not. I mean, I'm not saying don't use metrics, right? I think I've seen sort of dashboards and frameworks used to ask the right questions and slow the decision down. But I've also seen them as well used to document and justify the wrong decision as well. So it's knowing what you're using for, and that's not the dashboard or the metrics fault. That's the person designing them and writing them, right? That's the power lies with the person. I guess what I'm trying to do is call for honesty in these because how many dashboards have we seen and sort of hide something or it's caveated or someone's gamed it in some way as well, but know the power they have, right?
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of a time when I was I picked up a business case and some of the benefits were double counted for a really
Mm,
complicated reason, but it was something that I'm like, well, they're double counting a significant amount of benefit, and
mm.
that affects the financials of the business case. So I put this forward, and the project manager was like, "Yeah, but we'll just find the benefits somewhere else. So we're just going to leave it inaccurate." And I was like, "Well, what you're saying then is this is a farce. I mean, I didn't put it in those words, but it's like if like if you're not gonna if you're gonna allow
Mm.
something with double counting to go through, then the decision maker isn't making an informed decision. You're obfuscating the truth from them,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
and almost like if you're going to do it anyway, irrespective of the business case, just say that. I mean, again, I couldn't say it that bluntly, but you know what I mean. It's like just say you're just going to do it, even if it's going to cost you more than it's going to bring you back.
yeah, yeah. It's about knowing this. I mean, I think when we done our chat, Adrian, like another element of this, what I wanted to try and get was that you put these metrics out there sometimes, and they do drive behaviour, but it's not necessarily the behaviour that you think it's going to drive, right? I think I told you the story about when I done some call centre optimization way back in my distant past. And the big benefit was less time on the call. Less time on the call, right? Less time on the call. Call volumes went up because the manager were incentivized to cut down the time of the call. So the operators were just sort of rude and horrible, cutting people off and not helping them at all as well. But we put these dashboards out there and they do shape reality. They do drive behavior. There's one of the things I want to call out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And on that note, I always think it's interesting how most organizations can't actually see an end-to-end customer inquiry because what they measure is transactions. So
Yeah.
they'll know that the average speed of answer is 30 seconds, the average call handling length time is 3 minutes. But what they won't know is one customer has had to have 75 interactions to
Yeah.
solve a relatively small problem. You know, it's like that. It's not tracked across or very few organizations do that well. And yeah, that's one thing I think. Whereas BAs, we're actually usually quite good at saying, look, here's an end-to-end process. Don't just measure activity, measure outcome. Like, I mean, you might need to measure activity as well because your activity leads to the outcome. But activity without outcome, it's just theatre, really,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Well, theatre of control, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
there was one other sort of message that I sort of hope people pick up from it as well was that look, as BAs, we don't just go on the numbers, right? Go on your gut and your instinct as well. And I think there's like some BAs say that they're pressure not to do that, to be much more sort of analytical side of things as well. I think when we're placing a project as well, we know when it's not right, or
yeah.
we know, and like listen to that. I think it's the important. I think it's the most important skill we have.
Intuition as a form of
Yeah.
insight, I think is important. So, great. Well, so I've just got a few closing announcements, but I do just want to call out a few things. There's been lots in the chat, so if I don't read your chat message out, I apologise. But a few things I wanted to point out. John was saying that SLAs are rife with the wrong incentives. Absolutely, I've
Yep.
seen that. I'm sure we have. Petrus put some interesting stuff about Deming in there that if do go back and read that. James has said calling out diplomatically when possibly, of course, doesn't have to be verbally, but can be via email or phone call or video call, which is also right, of course. And yeah, and lots of other interesting stuff in the chat. So that's another thing. If you're watching the recording, you see you miss out on all the chat. So the people who are here live get to see that additional insight. So thank you very much, Russell. Um,
Pleasure. Thanks for the
just
question.
No, no, absolutely. Just if you're still here live, stay on the line because there's a few closing announcements. So, first of all, um, if you like this webinar, then I try and do them monthly. So our next one is on the 2nd of June, and it's Don't Let the Machine Do Your Thinking, AI's Tool, Not the Master with Mick Bryan. I have put the link in the chat there already. So I think about 75 people have signed. I only put it live a while ago, and about 75 people have signed up already. So that's going to be a popular one. You will hopefully already be aware of the quarterly PDF magazine BA Digest, which is completely free. And if you're not, then I'm going to put the link in the chat for you now. It's badigest.link. So that is a completely free quarterly magazine filled with insights. If you like webinars or magazines as well as webinars, do check that out. Finally, the recording for this session will be out within about 24 hours. And that again is made freely available. So if you've had colleagues that couldn't make this session and you want to send them the link, that's fine. We really encourage you to do that. The same with BA Digest. If you've got colleagues that would benefit from it, do the community-minded thing and pass that on. So all that's left for me to say after that is a massive thank you to everyone who has attended live, or if you're picking up the recording. But mostly, thank you very much, Russell, for taking time out of your
Absolute
evening.
pleasure.
So
Absolute pleasure.
thank you very much. Huge round of applause. See you all next time. Bye for now.